Hey there. Ready to jump into some really fascinating stuff today?
Always up for a good deep dive. What do we have?
Well, we're going deep into the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition,
Yeah.
but not the whole thing. We're going to zero in on the Science of Identity Foundation. You might know them as CEF,
Ah, okay, I've heard of them.
and their founder, Chris Butler.
Right, and he also goes by Jagadguru Siddheswar Upananda Paramahamsa, is that right?
Yep, that's the one.
Bit of a mouthful, huh?
That's what I thought. And that name actually hints at some of the complexities we're going to unpack today.
Interesting.
So we've got a whole mountain of sources here. Court documents, news articles, even forum posts from former CEF members. It seems like there's a story here that goes way beyond just, like, theological debates, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And what I find particularly interesting about this is how it all ties together, like spiritual beliefs and these allegations of broken vows and even political influence. Like SIF's founder, Chris Butler, he positioned himself as a spiritual leader, a sannyasi. That means someone who has renounced worldly life to completely dedicate themselves to spiritual pursuits. But the sources we're looking at today, well, they kind of suggest a different picture.
Okay, so I think before we jump into those allegations, can we take a step back? I think for those of us who might not be as familiar with Gaudiya Vaishnavism, can you give us a little context? Like, what are the core beliefs and practices of this tradition?
Sure. So Gaudiya Vaishnavism is a branch of Hinduism centered around the worship of Krishna. It really emphasizes bhakti yoga. That's the path of devotion.
Gotcha.
It's known for its colorful traditions, chanting, and this belief that through devotion and chanting, you can achieve a loving connection with the divine.
So, chanting, devotion to Krishna, and a strong emphasis on a lineage of teachers. So then where does CEF, like, fit into all of this? Because from the sources, it seems like there's a lot of debate about whether their practices and beliefs really align with traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Yeah, that's really the heart of it, isn't it? And that's where things get, well, they get really interesting. For example, the sources mention SIF's involvement in politics. They even formed their own party, the Independence for Godly Government, in Hawaii. So this political involvement, especially when it seems to, blend religious beliefs with secular governance, it's pretty unusual in traditional Gaudiya groups.
That's definitely not your typical image of a Krishna conscious movement. Makes you wonder about their motivations and how their understanding of, quote, godly government might differ from traditional Gaudiya interpretations of spiritual life and worldly affairs.
Right, right. Then there's the whole issue of the Gabbard family. They were involved with CEF. Mike Gabbard, he rose to political prominence in Hawaii. But despite evidence of his connection to the group, he publicly denied being a follower of Chris Butler.
Wow, that's a pretty bold move, especially for a politician. It raises all sorts of questions about, like, what kind of influence CEF might have had and whether political ambition played a role in him, downplaying that connection.
It definitely adds another layer to this whole story. And speaking of layers, the sources also describe a pretty hierarchical structure within CEF itself. Apparently, newer members, especially those who joined later in life, they had very limited access to Chris Butler's teachings.
Huh. So it's almost like there's this inner circle with this special privileged knowledge.
Exactly.
Makes you wonder why there would be, like, such a barrier to knowledge within a spiritual movement that supposedly emphasizes devotion and, a direct connection with the divine.
It's a great question, and it really gets at one of the core issues we'll be exploring in this deep dive. Like, how do Chris Butler's actions and teachings, even the organizational structure of CEF, how they align with the principles and practices of traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism? And even more importantly, how do these deviations affect the lives of the people who followed him?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of those impacts, especially the negative ones, stem from the allegations against Chris Butler himself. The sources, they paint a pretty troubling picture of his behavior, especially for someone who is supposed to be a sannyasi.
You're right. And remember, a sannyasi is someone who is supposed to have renounced all worldly attachments, dedicated themselves fully to spiritual life. They take specific vows, that dictate their behavior and interactions with the material world. But the allegations against Butler, well, they suggest there's a stark contrast between his claimed spiritual status and his actual actions.
So, like, for example, the sources mention financial impropriety, potentially even exploitation of his followers' labor in his businesses. And then there are the more personal allegations, like breaking his vows of celibacy, engaging in relationships with multiple women.
And these are serious accusations. They really challenge the integrity of his position as a spiritual leader and a sannyasi.
Yeah, it's almost like there's this tension between the image he projected, the guru, the renunciate, the spiritual guide, versus the reality of his actions as described in these sources.
That's a great observation. And it's this tension, this dissonance between the ideal and the alleged reality that really makes this deep dive so compelling. We're not just talking about like abstract theological debates. We're dealing with real life consequences for the people involved.
Okay, so we've got Gaudiya Vaishnavism, a tradition that's all about devotion, chanting, and a lineage of teachers. Then we have SIF, led by Chris Butler, presenting itself as part of this tradition, but also venturing into politics, creating a hierarchical structure within the group, and facing these accusations of deviating from core Gaudiya teachings and practices. But what specifically are those deviations, and how do they impact our understanding of Chris Butler and his movement?
Right. Right. Well, that's what we'll be unpacking in more detail. We'll look at specific examples of Butler's teachings and analyze how they differ from the traditional Gaudiya lineage. And we'll explore what consequences those differences had for his followers.
Sounds like we're just getting started. I'm already hooked. What do we have coming up next?
Next, we're going to dive into some of the most controversial teachings attributed to Chris Butler, including his pronouncements on reincarnation and self-realization. We'll compare those to the traditional Gaudiya understanding and examine how these potential deviations might have impacted his followers' spiritual journeys.
It seems like we're about to get into the heart of the matter. I can't wait to hear more. All right, so we've kind of set the stage. We know a little about Gaudiya Vaishnavism. We've got a sense of SEF and its founder, Chris Butler. But now I really want to get into the details. You mentioned some of Butler's teachings raised red flags within the tradition. Like, what were some of those controversial ideas?
Well, one of the key areas where Butler's teachings seem to diverge from traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism is in his pronouncements on reincarnation. The sources we have, including accounts from former members, they suggest Butler presented a rather unique view of reincarnation, and some might say distorted, especially when it came to the concept of jiva tattva.
Okay, I'm going to need a little bit of a breakdown here. Like, what is jiva tattva in traditional Gaudiya context, and how did Butler's interpretation differ?
Sure. So in traditional Gaudiya philosophy, jiva tattva refers to the eternal individual soul. It's the essence of who you are, separate from the material body and mind. The idea is that the soul, it transmigrates through various lifetimes, taking on different forms based on, past karma and the pursuit of spiritual liberation.
So it's kind of like the soul is on this journey through different lifetimes, trying to ultimately achieve union with the divine.
Right, exactly. But according to the sources, Butler's teachings on Jiva Tattva, they seem to downplay the significance of individual souls. There are accounts of him suggesting that individual souls could merge back into like a universal consciousness, essentially losing their distinct identities. And this notion, it really goes against that core Gaudiya belief in the eternal nature of the individual soul and its unique relationship with Krishna.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant departure from the traditional understanding. It's almost like he's presenting a more impersonal view of spirituality, where the goal is to dissolve into some universal oneness, rather than cultivate a personal relationship with the divine.
Yeah, that's one way to interpret it. And it's definitely something that troubled many people within the Gaudiya community. They saw Butler's teachings as a distortion of their tradition. It also raises questions about how these teachings might have affected his followers. Did they really understand the implications of this different view of the soul? Did they feel a sense of individual agency in their spiritual journeys? Or were they kind of encouraged to surrender their individuality to Butler's interpretation of this universal consciousness?
It makes you wonder how these teachings played out in the lives of the people who trusted him as their spiritual guide. Did they feel empowered by this idea of merging into the universal? Or did it create a sense of dependence on Butler's authority?
That's a great question. And it really speaks to that potential impact of these deviations on individuals' spiritual experiences and their relationships with the tradition. And this wasn't the only area where Butler's teachings were controversial. The sources also mention his pronouncements on self-realization, which again seemed to contradict the traditional Gaudiya understanding.
So how did Butler's take on self-realization differ from the traditional Gaudiya path?
Well, in traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism, self-realization is about recognizing your true nature as an eternal servant of Krishna. It's a process of purification, devotion, and surrender to the divine will. It's not about achieving some kind of, egoic enlightenment or becoming a god yourself.
And it sounds like Butler might have been promoting a different kind of self-realization, something maybe more focused on on individual power or attainment.
Yeah, that's the impression we get from the sources. There are accounts of him suggesting that individuals could achieve a state of self-realization where they were essentially beyond, good and evil, beyond the need for any kind of moral or ethical guidelines. And this is directly in conflict with the Gaudiya emphasis on bhakti, which is all about cultivating humility, compassion, and ethical conduct as expressions of devotion to Krishna.
It seems like a very different message than the traditional Gaudiya path of devotional service.
Yeah.
And you can see how this kind of teaching might lead to problems, especially if it's interpreted as as a license to just disregard ethical boundaries or act without accountability.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Chris Butler's status as a sannyasi. Like, if he's promoting these ideas of self-realization as this kind of liberation from moral constraints, how does that even reconcile with the vows of renunciation and ethical conduct that a sannyasi is supposed to, uphold?
Yeah, that's a pretty big disconnect. It makes you wonder how he could justify those teachings within the whole framework of sannyasa. And not only that, the sources mention some pretty serious allegations about Butler breaking those vows in various ways. We've already touched on the financial impropriety and the relationships with women. But what are some other examples of his alleged transgressions?
Right. So one of the key vows of a sannyasi is to relinquish ownership of material possessions. They're supposed to live a life of simplicity and detachment, relying on the goodwill of others for their basic needs. But the sources suggest that Butler, he actually maintained a rather lavish lifestyle, accumulating wealth and property, which directly contradicts the principles of sannyasa.
So it's like that old saying, do as I say, not as I do. If he's living a life of luxury while preaching, renunciation, it undermines the whole concept of sannyasa. And it raises questions about his sincerity as a spiritual leader.
Right. And it's not just about material possessions either. The sources also describe a pattern of behavior that it seems to contradict the spirit of humility and service, the kind that a sannyasi is supposed to embody. There are accounts of him exerting a lot of control over his followers, demanding obedience, and even using his position of authority to manipulate situations to his advantage.
It sounds like there's a real power dynamic at play here, one where he might have been using his spiritual authority for personal gain or to just, maintain control over the group.
Yeah, that's a valid interpretation. And it's something that we see, fairly often in cases where you have a charismatic leader. They can accumulate a lot of power within a spiritual or religious movement. It's a reminder that even within contexts that emphasize spirituality and selflessness, well, human nature with its tendencies towards ego and control, it can still be at play.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it?
Yeah.
It makes you realize you can't just blindly trust someone because they claim to be a spiritual teacher or a renunciate.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to look beyond those titles, beyond, charismatic personalities, and really examine the actions and teachings of anyone who claims to hold spiritual authority.
So we've explored these inconsistencies in Butler's teachings, the allegations of broken vows and the potential for abuse of power. But what about the bigger picture here? How do these controversies within CFIF reflect on the broader Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition?
That's a crucial question, and it's one that the Gaudiya community has grappled with for years. On the one hand, you have those who see CFIF and Chris Butler as kind of an anomaly, a fringe group that doesn't really represent the authentic teachings or practices of the tradition.
So they would argue that Butler's actions and deviations don't really reflect on the tradition as a whole.
Right, exactly. But then, on the other hand, there are those who argue that the very fact that someone like Butler could rise to prominence within the Gaudiya community, well, it points to maybe a deeper issue. They might say it highlights a need for greater vigilance, for more critical examination of teachings and for a stronger emphasis on ethical conduct within the tradition.
So it's not just about dismissing CIF as an outlier. It's about using this as a learning experience to strengthen the integrity of the tradition as a whole.
Precisely. And it also raises questions about the nature of spiritual authority itself. Like, how do we as individuals seeking spiritual guidance, how do we discern between authentic teachers and those who might be manipulating or distorting teachings for their own, purposes? What are the red flags we should be aware of, and how can we cultivate the discernment necessary to navigate these complex landscapes of belief and authority?
Those are Those are big questions. And they're not limited to the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition.
Yeah.
It seems like something we all need to grapple with
Yeah.
as we try to find meaning and purpose in our lives.
You're absolutely right. The story of Sif and Chris Butler, it serves as a reminder that even within, spiritual traditions, there's a need for critical thinking, for questioning, and for holding leaders accountable to the principles that they espouse.
It's a powerful lesson, and one that I think will resonate with anyone who has, ever sought spiritual guidance or grappled with, the complexities of belief and authority.
Definitely.
So where do we go from here? What's the next step in our deep dive into the world of Sif and its controversial founder?
Well, we've laid out the theological deviations, the broken vows, and the potential for abuse of power. Now I think it's time to shift our focus to the impact of all of this on the individuals who actually joined S. What drew them to this group in the first place, and how did they navigate the contradictions and controversies that emerge?
It sounds like we're about to get into the human side of this story. I'm curious to hear about the experiences of those who were drawn into Seth and how they made sense of it all. It's fascinating to think about what drew people to Seth in the first place. I mean, we've talked about all the controversies, the deviations from traditional Gaudiya teachings, the allegations against Chris Butler, but something must have resonated with the people who joined the movement. Oh, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of people who were drawn to Sif, they were generally looking for spiritual connection, meaning a sense of community. They might have been attracted to the chanting, the devotional practices, or the idea of connecting with Krishna.
It's easy to get caught up in all the controversies and kind of forget that for a lot of these people, this was about a deeply personal search for truth and belonging.
Yeah, and for some, Sif might have provided that structure, that sense of purpose, even that feeling of being part of something, bigger than themselves. It's not uncommon for people who are, seeking spiritual growth to be drawn to groups that offer a clear path, a sense of belonging, and a charismatic leader who can provide, that guidance and direction.
It's not necessarily about people being like naive or gullible. It's about that very human need for connection, for meaning.
Yeah.
A sense of direction in life.
Exactly. And it's important to, to approach these stories with empathy and understanding, even as we critically examine the potential for manipulation and abuse within these contexts.
Yeah, for sure. The sources we have, especially those forum posts from former members, they offer some really interesting insights into those individual experiences. What are some of the recurring themes or sentiments that emerge from those accounts?
Well, one of the things that really struck me was the sense of disillusionment expressed by many of the former members. They talk about initially feeling really inspired and uplifted by Chris Butler's teachings, but then gradually becoming aware of these inconsistencies, contradictions, even hypocrisy within the group.
It's almost like this gradual awakening to the reality behind the facade.
Yeah, and that awakening can be a really painful process. A lot of former members describe feeling, betrayed, confused, even angry as they realized that the image they had of Seth and its leader, it didn't align with their own experiences or the principles they thought they were following.
Yeah, it's a reminder that spiritual journeys, they can be, complex, messy, and sometimes even heartbreaking. And it's also, a real testament to the courage of those who are able to break free from a system that might have felt controlling or manipulative.
Oh, absolutely. Leaving a group like Seth, especially after years of, investment and devotion, it can be incredibly difficult. There's often that social pressure, that fear of losing one's community, even threats of spiritual harm. But despite all of these challenges, many individuals found the strength to leave and to rebuild their lives.
And their stories they're incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
They provide a glimpse into the inner workings of this controversial group and the impact it had on real people's lives.
Right, and their experiences also highlight the importance of critical thinking, of questioning and trusting your own intuition, even within a context that emphasizes faith and devotion.
It's a message that really goes beyond the specifics of Sif and Chris Butler. It's about It's about empowering individuals to think for themselves,
Yeah.
to evaluate information critically, to make choices that align with their own values and understanding.
I think that's one of the key takeaways from this whole deep dive. It's not about condemning anyone or passing judgment. It's about encouraging thoughtful reflection, open dialogue, and the courage to question anything that doesn't sit right with our own sense of truth and integrity.
Well said. So as we wrap up this exploration of Sif and Chris Butler, what's the final message you want to leave our listener with? What's the most important thing to remember as they navigate their own spiritual journeys or encounter groups and leaders who might raise those red flags?
I think the most crucial thing is to really cultivate discernment. Don't be afraid to ask those questions, to seek out multiple perspectives, to compare teachings to traditional sources, and to trust your gut instincts.
So it's about approaching spirituality with an open mind,
Right.
but also with a healthy dose of skepticism and critical thinking.
Yeah, and remember, genuine spiritual growth should empower you, not control you. It should encourage you to think for yourself, not just blindly follow someone else's dictates.
It's about finding a path that resonates with your heart and your mind, a path that leads to greater understanding, compassion, and connection with the divine, however you understand that to be.
Yeah. Right, and if a group or a leader starts to feel controlling, manipulative, or contradictory to your own sense of truth, don't be afraid to step back, reevaluate, and maybe even, walk away. Your spiritual well-being is worth protecting.
That's a powerful message, and I think a fitting note to end on. Thanks for guiding us through this deep dive. It's been eye-opening, thought-provoking, and ultimately, I think, empowering for anyone seeking a deeper understanding of these complex issues.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listener, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep trusting your own inner compass. That's the true path to spiritual freedom.